Welcome to Know Before You Go for the second Sunday of Easter. My name is Father Brendan Curran, Dominican Promoter for Justice and Peace for North America, joining you from the Convento de Santo Domingo, Bayamón, Puerto Rico. I'm here gathered together with our friar provincials of North America, the four provinces of the United States, the provincial of Canada, and the vicar from the Vicariate of Vietnam, whose members are exiles from Vietnam who serve in Canada in the United States. Each and every Easter week, they gather together to refresh their commitment with one another and to support one another in solidarity in living out the gospel of being members of the Dominican family. And so what appropriate place to be gathered this year as each of them rotate. We are in Bayamón, Puerto Rico, where our Dominican friars serve throughout the year. And we are gathered on this second Sunday of Easter. What an appropriate, symbolically powerful place to come together on this Mercy Sunday. On this Sunday in days in which we mourn the passing of our dear pastor, our dear shepherd, Pope Francis. In remembering visions and moments and visits of his of the past years and his courage and commitment to be a sign and ambassador of God's life and God's hope for our world, within the church and beyond, throughout our society and in our civic community, leaders joining from across the world to mourn his passing. But we are in the light of the Spirit of Christ resurrected. We are mindful that on this Sunday, this Mercy Sunday, we are mindful that it's the day we mark in a very unique way of the doubts of doubting Thomas. We know that gospel story, but let's get into the other readings first. The first reading, as we hear throughout the Easter season, signs through some of the chapters of the book of the Acts of the Apostles, of the early courageous works of apostles who once even could not understand their role or mission, denied knowing Christ in the night most needed when Christ was arrested, and yet became the ambassadors of the faith, even risking death and their very own crucifixion for the sake of the gospel. It is in that context that we read the first reading today. As we hear, many signs and wonders were done among the people at the hands of the apostles. Powerful stuff. In their context, amazing. We also hear the power of their witnessing of how the apostles touch people's lives. It is said, it is quoted in the 5th chapter of the first reading of the Mass today, where some people of the villages brought out their sick, those in need of a prayer, out before the path where the apostles and other followers walked, in order that even by the shadow of their presence, like Peter, they might be healed. Can you imagine the kind of faith of even feeling that the shadow of those who are witnesses, direct witnesses of Christ's love, could somehow touch and change your lives? That's some of the spirit that the second Sunday of Easter calls us, encourages us, and demands from us as witnesses of the gospel. In the second reading, the reading of poetry of a unique book that we read only a few times through the year, the book of Revelation. We hear a book of signs of a vision of new earth and new sky, where things that had fallen apart and were being destroyed could be renewed once again. In signs of early writers who had witnessed great destruction is the poetry of seeing beyond it to new hope in signs on the horizon of new lives to come in future generations. That's some of the spirit we each need. As we hear in the second reading today, we write on a scroll what we see. Being called to write on a scroll what we see. I heard a voice as loud as a trumpet, the voice of that scripture says, which said, write on a scroll what you see. We are called to be messengers of the touch of Christ's life for our world. There's plenty of noise out there that talks about sincere and actual conflict and crises. You know them in your own family. You've been through that at the Easter dinner table. The sense of the differences and struggles of getting along as family, even on those phone calls, some of them not so pleasant, just to check in with one another or ignoring others. You know the spirit of that. This Sunday, this second week of Easter, we're called to refresh anew our spirit of hope, anew our spirit of hope. Yes, in the gospel today, we read that story about those early followers who witnessed the risen Christ. Some of them were not together in those first visits of Christ, of the risen Christ, to the early apostles and early Christian communities. He broke into those rooms, those upper rooms, locked with the door, windows and shades closed for fear of the authorities. Christ conquered all of those fears even after his death, even after walking and healing the blind and curing the lepers and inviting the outcasts that you too belong. Christ wasn't done yet. Christ's mission doesn't end at the tomb, at his death, at the crucifixion on Calvary Hill. You know this. You know the story. After he was taken from the cross, on the third day, they witnessed, those early witnesses, to complete the rituals of the buried Christ, of the deceased Christ, saw a stone rolled aside and saw the tomb was empty. It doesn't mean our faith is empty. It means that Christ has been empowering us and continues to renew us to see the new life of Christ. So of course we have Thomas, who is bold enough and courageous enough to admit his doubts, admits his anxieties, admits his uncertainties. That's the Thomas we read in the gospel, a famous story. Once he hears the testimony that others saw the risen Christ, that he is risen from the dead, that they did visit with him, in visits with him, he said, I will not believe until I see, until I probe my hand into his side, until I probe the marks of the wounds of the nails in his hands. Not till then will I believe. I think Thomas was trying to say courageous words that the other apostles didn't have the guts to share themselves. This is inspiring, not just for them, but for each of you and me. We could be mourning the loss of our shepherd, Pope Francis, as well we should. But we remember that we are people who are believers in new life after death. That God helps us conquer struggles of illness, struggles of poverty, impoverishment, and even in this land, this holy land of the island of Puerto Rico, which I have the privilege to stand today. Some of those who came before us were the voices like Antonio de Montesinos, who had the courage in Santo Domingo on an Advent Sunday to preach for the community on behalf of the community and say, with what right do you have the right to put these people into slavery? Are they not human like each of us? How often do each of us commit those sins? A bit more subtle than the drama of the historically offensive oppression of slavery in those days. No matter what their threats, even of threat of death, those early friars preached good news of hope for the indigenous eyes and faces of their communities throughout the Americas. Where's that power of courage today? Where's the power of courage of St. Thomas that can probe into his own hands the wounds of doubts, anxieties, and uncertainty, the wounds of a world thirsting for Christ's healing, of those who have been oppressed within their own families in domestic violence, within their own communities, of being prejudged like racism and so many other signs of war like Ukraine and Syria, and the Palestinian people and their struggles with the Israelis, to find new signs of hope in some source of agreement to continue to live and thrive in the same land together. It requires power of courage from each of us, not just far away from us, but also right where we live: Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, Montreal, Vancouver, here on the islands of the Caribbean and beyond. Let Christ enrich our lives. Let us be washed in the waters of baptism of new life of Christ. He is risen. Hallelujah. Let us be the messengers, que seamos nosotros mensajeros de la voz de Cristo vivo en nuestros tiempos. Blessings to you, and may Christ's Easter joy live on in our hearts, words, and action.